way, you lost your buddy.
Yeah.
And you lost a buddy who's around your age.
Well, it's very difficult to lose friends, you know.
When Charlie Watts, the steady heartbeat of the Rolling Stones, passed away in August 2021, it marked not only the end of a chapter in the history of one of the world's greatest rock bands, but also one of the most emotionally complex moments for his surviving bandmates. Fans across the globe were stunned when news broke that Watts had died at the age of 80. The man who had been with the Stones almost since their inception, whose crisp yet understated drumming defined the band's sound for nearly 6 decades, was gone. But what puzzled many was the absence of his longtime companions, Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, and Ronnie Wood, from his funeral. For admirers who viewed the group as a brotherhood, it felt almost inconceivable that they wouldn't be present for such a final goodbye. Yet the reasons for their absence were tangled in logistics, health concerns, pandemic restrictions, and, most of all, Charlie's own values of privacy and dignity. To fully understand this moment, it's important to trace Watts's journey, his life, career, struggles, triumphs, and ultimately the quiet grace with which he left the world. Known as the most reserved of the Rolling Stones, Watts had always stood apart from the flamboyance and chaos that surrounded his bandmates. While Jagger strutted across the stage as the ultimate showman and Richards embodied the reckless spirit of rock and roll excess, Watts exuded stillness, composure, and a quiet authority. He was the moral compass of the group, the one who seemed least interested in the trappings of fame and indulgence. Yet even he wasn't immune to the struggles that come with age, success, and the pressures of a life lived under relentless public scrutiny. In the early 1980s, Watts entered what he would later describe as one of the darkest chapters of his life. By 1983, the stability that had long defined him began to crack. Though he had always been seen as the antithesis of the stereotypical rock star lifestyle, even he fell into a spiral of alcohol and drug use. Unlike Jagger and Richards, whose substance use often seemed tied to the myth-making of the rock world, Watts admitted that his problem stemmed from a much more personal place. His drinking and drug-taking, he later confessed, were not about chasing highs or rebellion. They were a misguided coping mechanism for family problems and the weight of middle age. "I think it was a midlife crisis," he reflected years later, noting that during those few years he became totally another person. His transformation nearly cost him his marriage to Shirley, the woman who had been his anchor long before. The Stones were famous. By the mid-1980s, however, Watts realized that if he didn't change course, he would lose not just his marriage, but himself. In typical fashion, quietly, without spectacle, he clawed his way back to sobriety and stability. By the end of the decade, he had not only regained control of his life, but also taken another major step toward better health. He quit smoking, a difficult decision for a man who had spent decades surrounded by the pressures of the touring lifestyle. For a time, this new discipline seemed to safeguard him. But in 2004, fans and friends alike were shocked when Watts was diagnosed with throat cancer. The diagnosis rattled the Stones. For decades, Charlie had been the constant in the band, the one they could always count on. He underwent months of radiotherapy, enduring the exhausting treatments with quiet resilience. When he finally entered remission, the Stones waited for him before recording again, honoring his recovery with patience and loyalty. "We'll only do a record when you're ready," Mick Jagger told him. True to their word, they didn't return to the studio until Watts felt strong enough, leading to the creation of a bigger bang in 2005. Astonishingly, only months after beating cancer, Watts embarked on a punishing 2-year world tour to promote the album. Joking in his understated way, he quipped that it seemed like whenever the Stones stopped, he got ill. So perhaps the solution was never to stop. For the next decade and a half, Watts carried on touring and recording, defying both age and his earlier illness. But by 2021, his health was again in decline. In August of that year, the band announced that he would not be joining them on the postponed US leg of their No Filter tour. Reports emerged that he had undergone heart surgery, and though he had intended to recover and rejoin the band, it soon became clear that this time was different. On August 24, 2021, Charlie Watts passed away peacefully in London, surrounded by family. His death was attributed to squamous cell carcinoma, a form of cancer, and in keeping with his lifelong preference for dignity over drama, his final hours were private and serene. Tributes poured in immediately. Mick Jagger shared an image of Charlie laughing, while Keith Richards posted a haunting photo of a drum kit with a sign reading, "Closed." Ronnie Wood spoke of their brotherhood, and even Bill Wyman, who had left the Stones decades earlier, remembered Watts as a beautiful man and gentle soul. Across the music world, the grief was palpable. Paul McCartney, Ringo Starr, Elton John, Brian Wilson, Pete Townshend, Nick Mason, Roger Daltrey, members of U2, Bryan Adams, Liam Gallagher, Brian May, Roger Taylor, Chad Smith, Questlove, Peter T. Feeder, Chris, and Max Weinberg were only a few of the many who hailed Watts as one of the greatest drummers to ever live, not only for his skill, but for his humility and grace. The Rolling Stones official website went dark, replaced for 10 days, with nothing but a black and white image of Charlie. The silence spoke louder than words. Days later, a moving video montage of Watts, set to their 1974 track If You Can't Rock Me, was shared on social media. The song opens with the line, "The band's on stage, and it's one of those nights." The drummer thinks that he is dynamite. For fans, the choice of track was perfect, a sly nod to his understated but vital role in the Stones' chemistry. And yet, when Watts was laid to rest in Devon, the remaining members of the Rolling Stones were not there. To some, this was shocking. But behind the decision was a complex web of circumstances. At the time of his death, the band was already in Boston, immersed in final rehearsals for the No Filter tour. This wasn't a casual warm-up. It was a monumental operation involving stage crews, lighting engineers, sound technicians, and months of preparation. Canceling or pausing would have created a cascade of financial losses and jeopardized the jobs of hundreds of people. The band also felt a responsibility to their fans, many of whom had held on to tickets since 2019 due to pandemic delays. International travel restrictions made matters even harder. In August 2021, strict COVID-19 quarantine measures were in place. Had Jagger, Richards, or Wood traveled from the US to the UK for the funeral, they would have faced mandatory isolation on both sides of the trip, potentially derailing the tour altogether. The Delta variant of the virus was spreading rapidly at the time, and the Stones had gone to great lengths to maintain a protective bubble around the touring party. Breaking it could have endangered everyone involved. Beyond these practicalities, there was also the matter of Charlie's own wishes. Known for his disdain of fuss, Watts's funeral was deliberately private, small, and attended only by close family. Those who knew him best insisted that this was exactly what he would have wanted. As former tour manager Sam Cutler put it bluntly, Charlie would have hated a fuss. Instead of attending the funeral, the Stones honored their fallen bandmate in ways that reflected his spirit. Every night of the tour, they opened with a tribute video showing Watts behind his drum kit. The iconic tongue and lips logo was altered to black and white as a symbol of mourning. On stage, Jagger often paused to speak about Charlie, while Richards and Wood quietly dedicated their performances to his memory. These gestures, subtle and respectful, resonated with fans worldwide. To understand why Charlie's absence was felt so deeply, one has to look back to the beginning of his story with the Stones. In 1962, Watts was already a well-regarded drummer in London's jazz scene when he crossed paths with Brian Jones, Ian Stewart, Mick Jagger, and Keith Richards. At first, he resisted joining their fledgling rhythm and blues outfit. He had steady work in jazz, which offered both financial security and creative fulfillment. The The Stones at that time were scraping by, playing small clubs for little or no money. But by January 1963, Watts agreed to join permanently, solidifying the lineup that would change rock history. His first show with the band took place on February 2, 1963, at the Ealing Jazz Club, a defining moment that began an unbroken streak of appearances on every Stones album and nearly every live show until his final concert in Miami in August 2019. Watts was far more than a drummer. A trained graphic artist, he contributed comic strips and cover art to the band's early records and dreamed up some of their boldest stage concepts. He masterminded the famous 1975 press conference stunt in New York, when the Stones shocked the city by performing on the back of a flatbed truck as it rolled down Fifth Avenue, a trick inspired by New Orleans jazz bands. Over the years, he also worked closely with Jagger on the design of the Stones' extravagant stage sets, from the lotus-shaped stage of the 1975 Tour of the Americas to the elaborate productions of Steel Wheels, Bridges to Babylon, and A Bigger Bang. Beyond his contributions to art and performance, Watts's personal discipline was legendary. He almost never missed a show, approaching each performance with quiet professionalism. His drumming was never flashy, but always impeccable, defined by restraint and groove. Musicians often remarked that his ability to play for the song, rather than for himself, was the secret to the Stones' enduring sound. Even after his death, his playing could be heard on the Stones' 2023 album Hackney Diamonds, which featured 2 tracks recorded before his passing, Mess It Up and Live by the Sword. These songs served as a bittersweet reminder that his touch would remain part of their music forever. Charlie's private life stood in stark contrast to the flamboyance of his bandmates. He married Shirley Ann Shepherd in 1964, years before the Stones' rise to superstardom, and remained devoted to her until her death in 2022. Together, they had 1 daughter, Serafina, and 1 granddaughter, Charlotte. Their home in North Devon was far removed from the excesses of rock and roll. Watts raised Arabian horses on his stud farm, indulging his passion for animals and the tranquility of rural life. Friends described him as meticulous, patient, and happiest when caring for his horses. He also collected cars, though he never obtained a driver's license, preferring to admire them as works of art. Another lifelong interest was cricket, which he pursued with the same enthusiasm and attention to detail that he gave to music. Watts managed to balance the dualities of his existence: the global rock icon who played to millions, and the quiet man who cherished privacy, art, and the rhythms of domestic life. He represented stability in a world of chaos, elegance in an industry obsessed with spectacle. His marriage endured for 57 years. His friendships stretched across decades, and his influence as both a musician and a gentleman remains unmatched. Even in death, Charlie Watts's legacy continues to grow. His estate has launched official social media accounts to celebrate his work, while his private collection of books and art has fascinated collectors worldwide. From a first edition of The Great Gatsby to a replica of the Bayeux Tapestry, his possessions reveal a man of refined taste and deep curiosity. His passing was mourned not with loud fanfare, but with the kind of respectful silence that he himself always preferred. The Rolling Stones, meanwhile, have carried on, as Charlie himself would have wanted. With Steve Jordan stepping in on drums, the band has honored his memory at every turn, ensuring that even as they continue to perform, they do so with his spirit always present. His understated brilliance, his devotion to his craft, and his quiet humanity remain etched in the hearts of fans and fellow musicians alike. Charlie Watts's absence from the world of music left more than a silence. It left a void that was uniquely his. Unlike many of his peers who craved the spotlight, Watts found satisfaction in holding the rhythm together quietly from the back of the stage. His philosophy toward drumming reflected a broader philosophy of life, Less is often more, and substance outweighs showmanship. In a genre dominated by flamboyant gestures, Charlie exemplified understatement. Yet, paradoxically, this restraint made him unforgettable. Musicians across genres often describe him as a drummer's drummer, the kind of player whose artistry is so pure and selfless that it commands respect from even the most technically flashy players. One of the most fascinating elements of Watts's artistry was his jazz background. Before joining the Stones, he immersed himself in the London jazz circuit, studying the styles of greats like Max Roach, Elvin Jones, and Charlie Parker's longtime collaborator, Kenny Clarke. Watts's jazz sensibilities never left him. They were evident in the swing of his groove, in his ability to give rock music a subtle elasticity. While many rock drummers attacked the kit with brute force, Charlie emphasized feel and timing, often laying slightly behind the beat to give the Stones their distinctive swagger. Keith Richards once joked that the Rolling Stones' entire sound was built on the Charlie Watts Shuffle. Without his pocket, Richards admitted, the songs simply wouldn't work. This unique approach also shaped the dynamics of the band itself. Watts was never one to compete for attention. He let Jagger command the stage, let Richards and Wood duel with guitar riffs, and let the audience roar at the spectacle. But all the while, his steady hand on the hi-hat and snare held the Rice entire machine together. Fellow musicians frequently marveled at how he could transform a simple two-bar groove into something hypnotic. His drumming on songs like Gimme Shelter, Honky Tonk Women, and Start Me Up wasn't complex in a technical sense, but it was irreplaceable. Remove Charlie, and the tracks lose their spine. Perhaps because of this, Watts became a mentor figure for generations of drummers. From Questlove to Steve Jordan to Dave Grohl, countless musicians cite him as a major influence. His lesson to them was that groove is king, that it's not about how many notes you can play, but whether you can make people move. Even Phil Collins once remarked that Charlie's ability to say so much with so little was a hallmark of genius. His humility was part of that influence. He didn't try to dominate, he tried to serve the music. Outside of the band, Watts's projects reflected his continuing love of jazz. He led the Charlie Watts Quintet, a group that paid homage to the music of his youth and recorded several albums that showcased his subtle brushwork and deep respect for swing. These ventures were never commercially huge, but they were artistically fulfilling, revealing another side of his creativity. For Charlie, the Stones were his career, but jazz was his passion. This balance sustained him through decades of rock and roll chaos. His relationship with Mick Jagger is another rich chapter in his story. Though the two men were very different, Jagger flamboyant and ambitious, Watts reserved and domestic, they developed a mutual respect. One of the most famous anecdotes in rock history highlights this dynamic. In the mid-1980s, during a night of drinking, Jagger reportedly referred to Watts dismissively as "my drummer." Stung by the slight, Watts left his hotel room, dressed in a full suit, and went to confront Jagger. According to Keith Richards, he grabbed Jagger by the lapels and said, "Don't ever call me your drummer again. You're my singer." The story, whether embellished or not, encapsulates Watts's quiet strength. He was not loud or boastful, but he commanded respect and knew his worth. Keith Richards, too, often spoke of Charlie as his anchor. Richards, famously volatile and unpredictable, leaned on Watts's steadiness both musically and personally. "Charlie Watts is the Rolling Stones," Richards once said. "Without him, we're not the Stones." That sentiment was echoed in 2021 when, after Charlie's death, Richards seemed visibly shaken during performances, sometimes pausing mid-song as though still listening for his old friend's beat. In the end, the absence of Jagger, Richards, and Wood at Watts's funeral was not a betrayal, but a reflection of circumstances. logistical, medical, and deeply personal. It was also, in its own way, a tribute to the man who disliked spectacle and valued privacy. Charlie would not have wanted a high-profile farewell. What mattered to him was the music, the art, the family, and the life he built away from the spotlight. His bandmates respected that, honoring him not by standing at his grave, but by carrying his rhythm forward on stage, night after night, in front of the audiences who loved him. Charlie Watts was more than just the drummer of the Rolling Stones. He was the anchor, the conscience, the gentleman who reminded the world that greatness doesn't always need to shout. His life was one of contrasts, public yet private, disciplined yet creative, simple yet extraordinary. And though he is gone, his beat continues, steady and timeless, echoing through the music that defined an era and will inspire generations to come.